Hey, Dr. Pedram here with Dr. Tami and our new best friend, Dr. Kulreet Chaudhary, who's one of us because she's a neurologist who did all the serious work, but she's super into Ayurveda and has some really cool stuff. So we're gonna have some fun today. Hey, welcome.
She's another MD that went over to the other side.
Totally. Crossover MD.
Went over to the light side. Yes, not the dark side.
So we have a really interesting conversation booted up today because we're talking about the gut-brain axis and how you almost stumbled upon it by just working with patients in one context and then figuring out that people were just generally getting better. So let's get quickly into your background and then tell us how you kind of got into this.
Well, I was trained as a neurologist, as a normal neurologist, as I call it. And very shortly into my training, I actually developed migraine headaches. And of course, no big deal, right? I'm a neurologist, I can handle migraine headaches. And as soon as I started myself on the medications that I was prescribing to all of my patients, I could not believe the degree of misery that little prescription pad had caused me. And it got to a point that, after experimenting with one medication after the next, I did what, every bright neurologist does. I went to my mom and said, Mom, I can't get rid of these. And fortunately, we grew up in a household where we were exposed to Ayurvedic medicine, but I hadn't really needed it up to that point. And so she introduced me to an Ayurvedic practitioner. And, the first meeting, he's asking all these questions about my digestion. And I'm like, look up here, it's a head problem. This has nothing to do with the gut. Yeah, I know what I'm talking about. And within 3 months, I was headache-free, but not just headache-free. It seemed to, I was a lot brighter. My energy was up. Issues with my digestion that I didn't even think existed were suddenly turned around. And so it was just a wake-up call, and it was impossible to go back to my patients practicing the medicine that couldn't even help me. So that's when I started to incorporate Ayurvedic medicine and traditional neurology, because having the test results and still needing medications for some patients was still helpful, but I just pulled both worlds together.
So the gut. Because you're obviously trained to look here. You're looking at nerves, you're looking at biochemistry. What is happening in the gut? And how are you going to reconcile your two worlds so that you can, live on both sides of that fence?
It was such a big shock to me that the gut was so intimately tied to the brain. And in Ayurvedic medicine, this is how they approach the brain, is through the gut. So crossing over to that world, I felt like kind of Alice in Wonderland, where everything seemed upside down and backwards. And, I hadn't been prepared for this at all from my traditional training. But what we're starting to find even now in some of our research is the huge impact that the microbiome, so your gut flora, actually plays on your brain health. And that there's this intimate relationship, which, I later researched, that the gut is actually doing a tremendous amount of talking to the brain. And many of our neurotransmitters, like serotonin, majority of serotonin, 90% of serotonin actually comes from the gut. And so these two systems are not separate. And we even have a nervous system in the gut called the enteric nervous system. And there's communication back and forth between the central nervous system, the brain in our head, with the brain in our gut. And so we're only now starting to find out these beautiful connections in modern medicine, but Ayurvedic medicine had this all mapped out, 5,000 plus years ago. And this was what was amazing to me as I started to incorporate this with my practice, that the nervous system, the brain in the gut, actually serves as a canary in the mine. So when things start to happen in the gut, what you can be assured of is down the road, people are going to have neurological symptoms. Even if it's just saying, oh, I've just got brain fog, or I'm having to do to-do lists all of the time, that it will eventually involve the brain. So for neurologists to say, hey, hold on, I actually have a system that I can look at first and prevent them from developing neurological symptoms, it was like just this huge kind of epiphany and this eureka moment.
Isn't it interesting that we say we have a gut feeling when we make decisions?
Yeah.
It's almost like there's an ancient part of us that knew this?
How can you not know this, really? I mean, and once I started to study it and I started to study, the relationship, it was so obvious and so common sense. And it was all the things like my grandmother used to tell me. And then when I would talk to my patients, they would say the same thing, like, oh, my grandmother used to tell us to do this. And it didn't matter what culture they were from. So it really is like this knowledge we once had, but we've separated the body into so many different organ systems that there's not space for that ancient knowledge when you're just looking at one teeny tiny little organ at a time.
Well, and you and I come from the same background, this traditional medicine, and not only have we separated the body, but we've separated medical practice. So the neurologist typically is not talking to the gastroenterologist at all. So you might have a patient who's actually seeing those two specialists and you would never even know.
And it's funny because when I started practicing like this, because a lot of neurological patients have GI issues. And so they're, and so their gastroenterologist would be calling me, they're like, what are you doing? They're off their proton pump inhibitors. We're taking them off all these medications that we were having to treat their acid reflux, and their IBS is gone. And I'm like, oh, well, I put them on a natural program for the brain. And they were just absolutely stunned at the results it was having on the gut.
I'm hoping that then translates into how they interact with patients in their practice, because it's just like, oh, she's doing some crazy witchcraft over there, right? Which is really interesting and doesn't fit the model, but I'm just gonna stay over here with proton pump inhibitors because I don't know how to look at that yet.
Right.
And so that's, I think, a really exciting part of medicine.
Well, what's funny is when I very first started doing this a decade ago, I was very much, treated like the voodoo doctor, and it was kind of a huge disappointment because I was very well respected as a neurologist, and it was like one of our own, one of the good ones, fell down this rabbit hole. And then what happened though is as we started having patients in common and they were like, hey, this actually feels good to start reducing their medication. But the kicker was when they started seeing some of the research coming out and they started to realize that, hey, this is actually, can be explained in terms that we understood, that the same mechanisms that we studied are now starting to be applied to these lifestyle interventions. And then it became really fun, and that's what I enjoy, is being part of the two worlds and being able to speak, this language and that language. When you become bilingual, right, it opens up like an entire other continent or another country for you to go to, and that's what I feel is I get to be a part of these two amazing worlds.
Great way to look at it, and it's a great time in history, really.
Oh yeah.
Right, because we have really amazing science, and we can look at things, under a very strong microscope. But Grandma was also right.
Yeah, she was. Right? The funny thing is, I still remember when I first started doing Ayurvedic medicine, and my grandmother lived with us, and I went to visit my mom, and she was asking me like, "What are you doing?" And I was explaining all of these remedies, and she goes, I could have told them that. Like, your parents spent how much money, and you're telling them the things that we used to do in the village?
I thought you came over here to progress.
Right.
Well, and when you marry both of those together, I think it's wonderful because then you take Grandma's wisdom and you create it into a reproducible system that can help so many more people.
Yeah, and I actually think it's really fun to bring both worlds together that way. And being able to go to my colleagues in the neurology world that are doing this work, like Dr. Dale Bredesen, who's doing amazing work in Alzheimer's disease, to be able to talk to him about a completely new paradigm shift in how we're looking at Alzheimer's disease, and then at the same time say, and by the way, my grandfather used to do this, exactly what you're teaching the patients. It brings what we do to life, rather than it just being the static clinical practice. It kind of feels like this whole history coming together upon us in a really warm, heartfelt way.
Well, speaking of upside down and Alice in Wonderland, that's kind of how your new book came to be, right? Because you were treating these brains, and lo and behold, much to your surprise, patients were losing weight.
And
you had to reverse engineer and go, wait a minute.
What is happening? And
this
is
going
honestly,
right
like as a neurologist, the last thing that you think of is weight loss. I mean, it's like the last thing I even cared about as a neurologist. But what I found is, I created this program to help my patients make the changes that I was asking them. Because when I very first got the knowledge in Ayurvedic medicine, I was like, oh, this is great. I'm just going to have everybody change the way they're eating, and we're going to have all these amazing results. And then I asked people to change, and they were like, I can't change. And these were bright people, they were professionals, they were succeeding in other areas. And so I had to figure out, why were they having such a hard time changing? And this is where I really started to understand the mind-gut connection and started to understand the biochemistry behind the choices that we make with food. But then as I started to put this whole system together, I was ecstatic that people's multiple sclerosis was, stabilizing and even reversing, that we were getting people off their Parkinson's medications. And what they would do is they would come in and they weren't just talking about their neurological symptoms. Oftentimes the first thing out of their mouth was, I haven't been this size in 30 years. And I was like, that's fine, that's great. But so no longer having any numbness, you're no longer having any ataxia. And they're like, yeah, but I haven't fit into these jeans.
It's not about what's important to me.
30 years. And this just kept happening. It happened over 10 years, and I still didn't think much about it. But what I found was that if I started to tell my patients up front that they would lose weight, they were actually more compliant with the program itself. And so I just kind of embraced it. But again, I never expected that we would write a book about it because I felt like it was so obvious. But as I started to teach this to people, the reaction I got was, no, nobody has actually talked about this biochemical obstacle that you first have to overcome, and then weight loss, as well as brain health, becomes spontaneous.
Can we tease out this obstacle a little bit?
Yeah,
because
sure.
I think everyone listening or watching is like, yeah, I got that obstacle.
Yeah.
Right?
And I don't know what it is, but I know it's there.
Yeah.
Well, and it's very, very common here in the US because of how much our foods have been changed. And so weight gain is really no longer a consequence of just our lifestyle. It's really a medical condition. And with every medical condition comes a unique biochemistry. And so what I did is I started to tease out what was the biochemistry of weight gain. Once we figured out that, hey, people were losing weight, I had to go back because I never intended that and had to say, okay, we figured out a solution. What was the problem? And so part of that problem has to do with this, gut-brain connection in what happens to the brain as we're exposed to food that really is being seen as a drug in the brain. And we have this process called neuroadaptation. And neuroadaptation is actually what keeps us alive. But when you are exposed to any substance, and so we often think about drugs being things like, alcohol or heroin or cocaine, but any substance that causes these spikes in your dopamine, in the brain, which causes an intense pleasure, what happens is your brain actually has to adapt to that in order to survive. So the way that food has been changed in America, we are seeing the same type of responses in the brain that you would see to drugs. So that was one aspect of it, is how do we normalize the dopamine response? How do we normalize this stress response that has been created between the brain and the body so that people are no longer addicted to their foods? And again, I didn't see that when I very first started. I had to kind of go backwards and figure out, why were they spontaneously giving up their French fries? Why were they spontaneously, giving up their sodas and their candies? Because I wasn't asking them to. I was just putting them on this program.
So when we're talking about this kind of biochemical piece to this, I really want to make sure that we're teasing this out. The dopamine is spiking because of something that's being done to the food, or it's also like an associative piece of the food? How like Big Brother, Big Ag is this?
Yeah.
Right? Versus like how we're eating.
Well, there's a real science behind it, and this isn't even hidden information. I mean, there is a well-known science to how to make foods addictive, and so the amount of fat, the amount of sugar that's going into it. They have studied, food industry has studied, people tend to buy more if we do this to it. And so it's just a good business decision. And, I'm not even against good business, but in this case, the consumer doesn't even know that it's happening and it's having this huge impact. But there's another aspect of this, and that's also what is happening in the gut. That as you're eating these foods, it's causing damage in the gut. And we know that in order for us to survive as a healthy individual, you have to have the right balance of bacteria in your GI tract, the microbiome. And so as the damage is happening in the gut, you're starting to kill off all of the good bacteria. And so now you're getting this overpopulation of bad bacteria, fungus is overgrowing. And so you have now this really unique food addiction because you're not just getting the signals from your brain, but you're also getting signals from your gut flora that are also now releasing all of these feel-good hormones every time you eat the foods that they need to survive off of. And so you have this kind of dual addiction going on. And then to kind of add insult to injury, you have this toxic inflammatory state that is occurring generalized in the body that makes almost any change impossible. And we have a term for this in Ayurvedic medicine. I don't know if either one of you ever heard of it. It's called ama. It's a new term for most people, and it's very hard to translate it because we don't quite have a medical definition of ama, but it literally means anything that is undigested. And so what you have, when you have broken down this barrier in the gut and you have leaky gut, you essentially have undigested particles going into the bloodstream, triggering an immune response. And now pretty soon you have an addicted brain, an addicted gut, this toxic inflammatory state where your immune system is attacking itself. And then you're asking somebody like, hey, just throw out, all of that white sugar and all that white flour. Just get rid of it. It's no big deal. Not that that's what you ultimately want your patients and you want people to do, but you can't just ask somebody in that biochemical state to do it like that.
Because it's like white knuckling it, and they'll
totally
only be able to do it for a short amount of time.
We know the research, how many people are able to change their diet, and about 85% of people can't do it. Only a small portion can. And I wish I could take credit of being like this, brilliant scientist who thought this out ahead of time, but I was just trying to figure out ways of saving the brain. And what I found was that in the process of saving the brain, we were healing the gut and healing the brain in the gut, and people were just spontaneously starting to make these changes, and they were giving up the foods and they were taking my advice, and oftentimes I didn't even have to tell them that something was bad for them. They were like, every time I eat this, I just feel sick. It makes me not want to eat it. And so what I realized is that brain in the gut was coming back online and they were communicating. And so my job got a lot easier because there was very little I had to do other than support what they were learning naturally.
Well, I think it's interesting that we think of food as medicine when we're trying to do good.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is food is medicine, and it's bad medicine, so it creates this biochemical change in your gut that has far-reaching things. And I have a lot of patients who say, well, I'll just take probiotics and I'll, repopulate the microbiome, but that inhospitable environment that we have doesn't make it so that the good guys can survive.
It's like sending Girl Scouts into World War II and saying, go and survive in there. You first have to clean out this environment. I'm all about, probiotics, but I don't even include this in the main part of the plan because it's still too early. And we got to keep in mind, our food has never been this processed. Like, we've never had such a natural food. 100 years ago, it was nowhere close to what it is now. So the food we're eating it's as strong as medicine. We know it's as strong as drugs, right? I mean, we've actually shown that on brain scans, that you're having the same response to sugar that a cocaine addict is having to cocaine. And so just like, taking just some random medication and then going, oh, I wonder what this is gonna do. Our food is no longer that gentle, loving experience that it was 100 years ago. It's really been engineered to have a strong biochemical effect.
So this is not a diet. This is not a food plan.
No.
So what were you doing with these people when you, right? Like, how'd you end up here?
Well, I tried to do the food plan way, and it didn't work. Like, people were struggling with it. And I guess this goes to kind of my neurologist temperament of like, we've got to do it, we've got to do it right. And I got so frustrated that I started to look at like how to rewire their brain so that they could do all of the right things. But my success rate and I don't know how you guys, what your experience has been in clinic, but my success rate when I was just asking patients to change the foods, because I knew exactly where they should be, but when I just came in and said, do this, it was about 25, 30%. And it was hard. I mean, it was a lot of hand holding and call me when you have that urge for, the
AA.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Literally.
It really
One
is.
bad choice over New Year's.
Yeah, and then it's all of a sudden they're
off.
right back. And it was just exhausting work. And so I had all of this knowledge in Ayurvedic medicine. And so I just started to implement okay, we're gonna rebuild the gut first. We are gonna break what's happening with these food addiction cycles in the brain first. We're gonna detox all of this toxic inflammation from the body first. And what I found is when I did that first, 75% of the changes in their diet started to happen spontaneously. And then I started to fine tune it from there. But they were already excited and they already lost weight without actively, consciously trying to change their diet. It was just happening because as you become less toxic, you can't put toxic foods in. The analogy I use for my patients, and most people get this, is when you're in a toxic relationship, right, and you're around it all the time, you don't even notice it, right?
Right.
And now let's say that you get a month vacation from it, right? And then you have to come back and you go, whoa, how did I put up with this? And that's what was happening to them on a cellular level. We were starting to pull all the junk out, and then when they would go back to that food, their reaction was how did I put up with your attitude before, How did I do this? And they would naturally start to decrease it until they would hit a point where they're I don't want this anymore.
So this is, detox is a word that's just, if you're in LA, you're not dieting anymore, you're detoxing.
Right.
I'm cleansing this week.
That's right.
Because I was so drunk last night, right? And so I want to tease this out because having been in Ayurvedic medicine, having been on this side of the fence, we know what it entails, right? Detox it's serious work.
Right.
What is happening that we're doing that then changes their behavior? Are we clearing out the colon? Are we clearing out or changing our diet temporarily? I need to wrap my brain around
Sure.
this.
So let me give you some examples. In one of the steps in the first phase is the simple tea, and you've probably heard of this, the cumin coriander fennel tea. We take it for granted because it's such a simple thing to make, right? All the ingredients are just right there in your kitchen. It's very easy to put together. But as soon as you start taking that tea, just that one simple step, and I give, several steps like this, but just that one simple step, those ingredients start to clear out your lymphatic system. And most people don't even know what the lymphatic system is. It's your garbage system in your body. And if your garbage is backed up, you get accustomed to living in trash. But when you start cleaning out the trash, you get accustomed to living in a cleaner environment. So just one tea, and all of a sudden your lymphatic system is starting to move out, starting to clean out, is starting to repair the gut. Just one simple intervention, and your gut is starting to heal, and the enteric nervous system, the brain in your gut, is actually starting to come back to life. And that's just with one simple little intervention. And so what I've done is I've added all of the things in the first step that I feel are necessary to just kind of clear out the system. And our first step is what most people do for their entire detox. To me, that's just the surface stuff. That's just to make sure everything is moving. And in there, we'll add an herb like trifla so that you are clearing out the colon, you're clearing out your lymphatic system, and you're starting to get the right signals in your gut. But then in the next step, we come up with a program to crush cravings naturally, and this has to do with the neuroadaptation. We're adding in foods, things like bone broth, which a lot of people don't realize how medicinal it is, which again, it's adding the nutrients, but it's healing the gut. And then in the third step is my favorite step because we add some of my favorite Ayurvedic herbs that, again, burn up all of these, we call them toxins, but it's so hard for me to explain because we don't have that perfect translation of what ama is. But you start burning off the junk that is just clogging the channels. And we're adding an herb that actually upregulates the cytochrome P450 family of enzymes in the liver. So your liver starts burning these things off. It just becomes more efficient. And then in the last step...
Oh, wait. Yeah. What is that herb?
I want that.
It is a phenomenal herb, but the reason why you don't do it until the third step is you have to be ready for it, and that's why we lead up to it. But the herb is called Google, And have you heard of, this is like, I think the two big it herbs for me in Ayurvedic medicine are Triphala and Guggul. They are phenomenal. Guggul is one of the most potent antioxidants out there. But what it does for the liver, because this is such a challenge for us, is people, they're on so many medications, they have these sluggish livers that can't...
And supplements.
Yeah, and supplements. And what
All
Guggul does is it just basically boosts liver function. And then, kind of this long line of chemicals that haven't been able to be processed sometimes for decades, like especially for patients who've been on chemotherapy where it just gets trapped in the liver for decades. All of a sudden your liver's like, hey, I've got the employees to get started again. And it just goes. It's phenomenal. I mean, you will love working with this herb. And it's such a popular herb in Ayurvedic medicine that we actually marry it to several other herbs and use it for almost every single condition out there.
And then your fourth step, because your program has 4
Yes,
steps.
and
So Guggul is step 3.
Guggul is part of step 3. We do several things in each step. And then in step 4, because now people are finally to start changing their habits, although I still don't ask them to change their foods. I never once talk about changing their foods, never taking anything out. In the 4th step, people are usually finally ready to start changing their habits. So I add in habits like meditation. And people, you don't usually think about meditation and weight loss. But it is critical because especially with the Guggul, because Guggul pulls out the old nasty stuff. And when we say undigested products, when we're describing Amma, we're talking about undigested emotions. And so as they start getting digested, people will suddenly be like, hey, why am I so angry? And they'll start thinking about things that happened in their childhood that they're like, I was in therapy for 20 years. Why is this still there? But there's still a cellular remnant of the experience, and that's what we're getting rid of. So if you don't have meditation at that point, this is usually when people sabotage their own success because they don't have a tool for dealing with it. And I give other, behaviors that are specific for Ayurvedic medicine, like moving your biggest meal. Still, you can eat whatever you want, but I just want you to move your biggest meal to lunchtime, smallest meal to dinner. And so by the end of the program, you have not been asked to take a single item out, but you will spontaneously have made multiple changes.
So I want a 4-step retreat.
Totally. Please just take some time and do this. Yeah, it's so simple, like, and so elegant, and at the same time, it's like, obviously, duh. Like, we should have known this.
Well, this is why I didn't even think of writing the book, because when I was first approached about writing a book, and I was like, no, I'm not doing anything interesting or unusual. I'm just, reversing brain damage, and then there's the spontaneous weight loss, but it's so obvious. Because once I figured it out, I was like, oh, this is so obvious. I'm sure everybody knows about this. But because of this kind of unique juxtaposition of neurology and Ayurvedic medicine, and there's just not a whole lot of us out there, that it brought to life kind of this connection between the brain and the gut that, as a neurologist, once you do this, you're like, oh, this is so obvious, but not a lot of neurologists are doing it.
It's like back when we thought that, bacteria had nothing to do with ulcers.
Right. And, so
and then now we're like, of course.
Once you know it, it's like, oh, so this, and really that's what convinced me to write this book was, when they said, look, this really isn't out there. You would be offering people a tremendous amount of help by clarifying this so that people don't punish themselves for not being able to make these changes, because I think there is a lot of guilt involved in why can't I just change the way I eat? I'm not big on guilt. And so when I see my patients just beating themselves up about why can't I do this? I've accomplished all these other things, but I cannot change the way that I eat. I see how liberated they feel when I explain this to them, and that really motivated me to give people this whole different perspective of why it's so challenging. And once you can take the guilt and just put it aside, you can go to work and change things.
It's tough because if I keep proving to myself that I'm a failure, I have no choice but to believe I'm a loser, right? And that's where a lot of these people deal with all the time. It's just like, well, what's wrong with you? Just stop eating sugar. It's like, well, my brain was addicted to it. Now I know, right? And so there's a piece that you talked about that I want to kind of come back to real quick and unpack, because I think it's a big one. Is you mentioned meditation and kind of this reverence for the process. And a lot of people will have this emotional upheaval and it's just pissed off and just irate and ornery, and it's just like whatever, it's a normal day at the office and I'm detoxing, and they don't leave that kind of space, the vessel, to allow for the emotional transformation.
Absolutely.
And so that part, I don't think anyone talks about in medicine very much, because it's like, oh, well, you go to the psychologist for that.
Right.
How did that start kind of creeping into what you're doing and helping people?
Well, the nice thing about becoming a patient first was I got to experience all of this, and I still remember when I started doing this, and I was like having all of these like angry feelings at my mom, like the way a teenager would, and I'm like, I think these are feelings from when I was a teenager. And so I got to actually experience it. And so when my patients went through it, the first thing I did when they started having these uncomfortable feelings was I would congratulate them and say, yes, you are at goal, you are on track. And so I would celebrate how lousy they felt, and I'd embrace it. Yeah, and the thing is, I have this feeling like we're trying to make detox look so sexy, like somebody's detoxing and, climbing a mountain, and I'm like, no, rest more. Like if you need to sleep for 12 hours, sleep for 12 hours, pull back on your responsibilities. And the way that we laid out this program in the book is we give people, they take a gut IQ test to see how smart their gut is. And depending on how much time you need, you go slower or you can go faster. But throughout the book, I keep encouraging, go slow. And we have all these adjustments if you're having a lot of detox, what to do. But I give a lot of my own personal examples. And, I really embrace kind of the emotional journey, and that's where a lot of the work is being done. And it's a little bit like spending your life carrying a mountain. And you feel it in everything you do, but you're unaware that you're carrying this mountain. And then finally, you have to start chipping away at it, and it's dirty and it's messy. But then the relief of not having a mountain on your shoulders every single day, it's phenomenal. So I mean, this is real work. We had fun doing this in my clinic, and I hope people have fun doing it, on their own. And I think it's only fun when you realize that this is truly transformative work. It's not surface work. This is how you come out on the other side, the person that you always hoped you could be.
And it's not compartmentalized. I'm not cleaning up my liver. I'm not fixing my gut. I'm healing and holistically. So your program is been laid out in your book, which is called The Prime.
Yes.
And it's available in bookstores now, I hear. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
So is it pretty much I can read this and I can self-guide my process myself? You
can, but what we are creating now, and it's going to launch in the spring of this year, is we're creating an online program called the Prime Club. And oh my gosh, I cannot even tell you how much fun I'm having creating the Prime Club, because it's for people who say, hey, I really get that this is going to be transformative and I really want to get into it. And so we've created this group experience, groups of 8 people at a time, and they go through the program. There's additional videos from me. We have live Q&As. All of the coaches are master coaches. They've actually gone through the Prime, and I am guiding them through the process as we speak right now. But the whole purpose is that loving environment of compassion and knowledge that I created in my clinic, we're creating online for this community. So for some people, they're going to pick it up and they're going to be like, oh, no big deal. For others, they're going to go like, oh, I can already tell that there's going to be a lot of stuff coming up and I don't want to do this alone. And so for those people, they can just go to the website, the Prime Club, and join the waiting list right now. And then when we're ready, we're going to just all do it together.
Love it.
Great.
It's interesting. It's like the real weight loss crisis is like a spiritual and an emotional one, right? It's the gunk and the crap that we've accumulated, both emotionally and physically, and from the cocoa pebbles we ate when we were a kid, right? And that's not the conversation that's happening. Everyone's talking about their upside down fad diet, but we're talking about is healing the body, which is a very interesting conversation. So here's the book. I have a copy. She's signing for me right now. And I highly recommend taking a look at this work.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
The Prime.
And I love the fact that you're an accidental hero in this. right? Because there's a lot of people that are like, oh, I'm going to write a book and get famous. Like, you could care less, but you're helping people, and people are saying, you need to write this book. And that's the kind of book I like to read. So thanks for doing it.
Thank you. It's funny because I'm like the last person to self-promote or, to like throw myself in the middle of a, media circus for this, but there is absolutely nothing that I wouldn't do for my patients.
Awesome. And that's why you did it, because I know writing a book's a lot of work.
It's a lot.
We all know this, yeah. Awesome. So good to have you on the show.
Thank you
where can
so
people
much.
find you? Do you have a website you can direct people to?
Yes, the website is just my name. It's Dr. Kulreet Chaudhary, and we keep that updated with everything that's going on. And it has all the information for the book. And we also have the landing page up for the Prime Club. And so if people want more information about what that experience is like, they can go there as well.
Awesome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Such an inspirational message that, it's not about just what you eat, that you can actually heal, and these cravings are really not because you're a bad person or you make bad choices, that you're just hardwired from our food, and there's hope.
That was beautifully summarized. I couldn't say it myself. Can you just come along with me?
Yeah, totally. Dr. Tami, I need you. Totally. Awesome. We'll see you in the next show. Thanks for being here. Let us know what you think in the show notes wherever you're seeing this. And we'll be back with more in a week.
And don't forget to share it.